Okay, good afternoon. Welcome everyone to the October edition of Green Infrastructure, Climate and Cities. My name is Franco Montalto, and I am one of the principal investigators on the Consortium for Climate Risks in the Urban Northeast, which is the NOAA-funded program that brings you this particular series. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, we've been doing these seminars going way back to 2014. Each of our webinars are livecast, recorded, and archived on ccrun.org, the CCRun website. So feel free, if you're interested in what you hear today, to go to the CCRun website and listen to any of our previous webinars, as I said, going back multiple years. We offer continuing education credits for professional engineers, and if you're interested in that, please email the Nikki Pearl, who you heard from when you registered for this session. So today, if we could go to the next slide, please. The focus of our seminar is a resilient vision for a historic park, and we're focusing on FDR park planning in South Philadelphia. And we really are looking forward to this presentation because this particular park and the planning around it brings together so many of the issues that we've dealt with and addressed in this seminar series going backwards. So issues of how do you restore habitats in places that are facing significant climate risks? How do you build multifunctional green spaces? How do you address equity and other community needs in the context of an urban environment? And so we're really fortunate to have this presentation today by two speakers, Allison Schapker and Maura McCarthy, and I'll introduce them each right now, and then they will give a presentation, and then we'll have an opportunity for questions and answers. And again, those of you who are joining us for the first time, we have a Q&A box in which you can submit questions, and I will field those questions, and depending on how many questions we get, I'll try to merge them together and pose them to the speakers and get some discussion going. So feel free to use the Q&A box to submit a question of your own, or to upvote a question that has been posted by someone else. So our principal speaker is Allison Schapker, the Chief Projects Officer of the Fairmount Park Conservancy. Trained as an architect and a landscape architect, Allison joined the Fairmount Park Conservancy in 2018 to lead the FDR Park planning process, although she manages other projects as well. Prior to her work on this particular project, she worked nationally on a variety of projects that connect, on the one hand, infrastructure, ecology, and design, and on the other hand, to people, programs, and finances. Locally, you may have known her name from the Venice, the Lower Venice Island project in Philadelphia, where she led the design team. That project received an award from the Delaware Valley Green Building Council and was also recognized by Philadelphia Magazine as one of the best urban transformations. So Ms. Schapker is joined by Dr. Maura McCarthy, Executive Director of the Fairmount Park Conservancy. Dr. McCarthy joined Fairmount Park Conservancy in 2019 and oversees community planning, capital projects, and land management for Philadelphia's 10,200 acres of parks. She's a native to the region and has an extensive record of public service, including serving on the steering committee of the Philadelphia Water Department's Clean Cities, Clean Waters program, and also serving as a member of the transition team of Mayor Jim Kenney, focusing specifically on environment and sustainability. So I'd like to thank our speakers for joining us today. We'll hand it over to Ms. Schapker to kick off the presentation. And like I said, add questions to the Q&A and we will go from there.
Thank you, Franco. And I just wanted to say that I'm really grateful for this opportunity to talk about this plan, in particular for this audience here. So I'm going to share my screen really quickly, and hopefully this will all work out. All right, so FDR Park Plan, a resilient vision for a historic park. Right now, you're looking at a great view of FDR Park that really puts this project into context in terms of its relationship to South Philadelphia, its relationship to Center City, Philadelphia, but also its relationship to land and water. And I love that in this image, the foreground is the lake. This park is so special because of the lakes And in fact, in the community, it's going to be known as, it's known as the lakes. And so this theme about water, land, and human activity is going to be intertwined through the entire presentation. So I've tried to set this up as sort of a narrative of the process that this planning work has gone through and sort of how we got to where we are today. And then that will be followed by a couple things that we tend to hear and some facts about the project. And then finally, we'll open it up to Q&A. So first of all, I want to put into context the two parties working on this project. FDR Park is a municipal park owned, managed, and operated by the city of Philadelphia, and in particular, the Department of Parks and Recreation. So that's a city department. I work for the Fairmount Park Conservancy. We are a nonprofit partner to the city of Philadelphia. So our work really consists of bringing parks to life. So that may be through public programming, that may be through generating additional resources, that may be through partnering with the city of Philadelphia on planning and design and construction on parks. So we partner with the city in a lot of different ways, but we are our own nonprofit. So I know that some folks might not be familiar with Philadelphia or familiar with the site. And so I want to put this landscape into a little bit of context. You're going to be hearing about these places throughout this presentation. So FDR Park is that 348-acre area in the pink box that you see. The star represents the intersection of Broad and Pattison Avenue. This is a civically significant intersection for its proximity to the stadium district, but also really critically, its location as the terminus of the Broad Street subway line. Just to the south, we have I-95. A couple blocks to the north, we have I-76. So this site, it has incredible transportation resources adjacent to it. To the south is the Navy Yard, which was transitioned from the Navy to the city of Philadelphia decades ago, and has become a real development opportunity for life sciences, and most recently for multifamily residential, which is a really exciting shift to see a neighborhood begin to develop just south of the site. To the site's east is the Stadium District. This is one of the few places in the country where all of the professional sports teams' venues are aggregated in one location, in one geography. And with that comes transportation and parking, but also a lot of eyes and a lot of foot traffic. To the west is the former PES refinery site that is now being developed by Hilco, known as the Bellwether District. And this is going to be, we understand, industrial and life sciences, but a huge landscape and a tremendous amount of transformation coming to the site, similar to what we're seeing at the Navy Yard. Minutes away to the site's west is the Philadelphia International Airport. And then just above that is the 1,100-acre Hines Wildlife Refuge. FDR Park sits just south of Center City at the bottom of the neighborhood known as South Philadelphia, which is a really dense row home neighborhood that is growing tremendously. So this is where we are, and this is the context of the site today. But FDR Park is a historic park. So till about the turn of the 20th century, this was originally farms and marshland until the city decided that it wanted to convert those marshes into land to be a park for the rapidly developing southern neighborhood south of Center City. They reached out in 1914 to the Olmsted Brothers. This is the famous landscape architecture firm that did New York's Central Park, Prospect Park, Boston's Emerald Necklace. And so the Olmsted Brothers came up with a design for the park that spanned Broad Street. So the east side of Broad Street was focused on active recreation. There was a track, grandstands, and a large field. The western half of the park, which ended at 20th Street, significantly different than today, and we'll talk about that. The western half of the park was basically a series of picturesque carriage paths, greenswards, and lakes and lagoons that were developed in the site's footprint. The goal for the Olmsted brothers was to separate the park from the hustle and bustle of the city around it. So there's a grade separation between the park itself and the city, which will become really important as we begin to look at and understand the hydrology better. But very, very quickly, almost as soon as the Olmsted brothers got their design on paper, things in the city started to change. So this site was, FDR Park was a site of the 1926 sesquicentennial, and you can begin to see that image on the upper left-hand side of your page. So the park was developed to support this celebration of the country. The eastern half of the park, the side on the eastern side of Broad Street, was formalized into the municipal stadium site, which existed many, many years into the future. And that really set the stage for the development of the Philadelphia sports complex. So almost as soon as the park is built, it's seen change. So there's the human and cultural history, but I think one of the really important pieces to think about the history of FDR Park is also this history of water. And I love the image at the top of the page. This shows the park in the 1940s. The historic eastern half of the park is in the bottom of the image. And you can see here the Olmsted Lakes, the edges of some of those green swards. And then in the background, you can see the half of the park, the western half, that was added to the site in the 1940s to be a golf course. The golf course was across the street from the Naval Hospital and the Navy Yard, and really existed to serve that audience. And so you can see here that even though this golf course is just under construction, it's already flooding. You know, we've got these little teeny tiny trees, and we've got flooding on this site. So clearly we have a land use that just isn't aligned with the existing conditions. On this bottom image here, you can see Meadow Lake, which was once two lakes in the original Olmsted plan, have been united and lined with concrete to create a swimming venue for Philadelphia. This existed until about the 1970s. And then you can also see how these picturesque lakes align with the historic architecture to create a very picturesque landscape. But it was a landscape the Philadelphians were used to engaging with and used to being in contact with and used to touching. So people used it for swimming, boating, and fishing. This is some of the relationship with water today at FDR Park. The park is severely impacted by flooding. We're going to talk about a lot of the reasons why. But one of the things that we heard during our community engagement process was that the amenities, the programs, the things that people needed to do and needed to get around in the park were not possible or not accessible because of the flooding on the site. We also were starting to see impacts in the tree canopy, particularly the trees that were built on the fairway of the old golf course because of our hotter, wetter future. And these tree species that were selected were not necessarily selected to be in a situation where they have wet feet regularly. So this is the condition in the park. So we've got water everywhere, and then nothing to drink or to swim or to touch. The water quality at FDR Park was severely impacted due to the amount of stormwater management that is coming onto this site. So these are the conditions in the park. You know, we have programmatic elements that are sitting in, that have been dropped in the park over the last 100 years and sitting in areas that experience regular flooding. We have a park that is divided between east and west. The eastern half being designed to be a park, historic, with a true circulation system. The western half of the park, it sits behind a fence and is a private golf course that is a golf course concession that is financially and literally underwater most of the time. The systems in this park operate completely separately, and the programming isn't aligned as well. So when we began this master plan, and the reason for beginning this master plan is this park is 348 acres. It's sitting in a neighborhood that is rapidly growing, particularly among families with school-age children. The park is being impacted by more frequent storms, hotter weather. We're seeing rising groundwater that is impacting the ability to use the park. 18-hole golf and traditional golf is losing participants on a national level. You know, having 148 acres allocated to golf might not be the best alignment with the recreational trends and the highest and best use in the park. And then finally, the Broad Street subway line right here is growing and it's seeing more and more use. So for all of these reasons, the city said, it is time to think about a master plan for FDR Park. We have to find a way to reorganize the systems in this park, to reorganize the programming in this park so that the park can serve all Philadelphians well into the future, despite the changes that are taking place in the climate. And so the park plan needed to operate, and the planning effort needed to operate on a few different tracks. The first track was to understand what are the programmatic requirements. So what things need to be happening in this park? What are the activities that need to be here? And in order to do that, we needed to use a really diverse range of stakeholder engagement techniques to understand both present and future programmatic opportunities in the park, based on what folks know today, but also based on the department's needs. So the Parks and Recreation Department's need in the entire system. How can this really important 348-acre site serve the entire city? Second of all, if we're doing a park plan that's really thinking about what is happening on the site over the next 50 years, we need to make sure that any plan that we put forward considers the changes in climate. So considers hotter summers, considers more frequent storms, considers and really incorporates PWD's climate predictions into a model and allows us to test alternative versions of the park and how that park will perform. We needed to understand the existing opportunities and constraints on this site. And finally, in a city where resources for operations and maintenance are always scarce, where we have an incredibly large park system with really diverse assets, but an incredibly low rate of city funding available to the park, we have to make sure that we bring the operations, maintenance, and revenue in alignment with whatever scenario or plan we're putting forward. So the FDR Park Plan is more than a drawing of what should happen here. It represents an alignment of what the site is, what Philadelphians need, both locally and broadly, citywide, what is going to happen with the climate, and how are we going to operate, pay for, and take care of these things. So a national RFP process was undertaken, and WRT was selected to lead this planning process. WRT is a local Philadelphia firm of landscape architects, and the vision that they put forward really was aligned around three ideas: renewing the impact of the plan, reclaiming the Olmsted vision, and restoring the function. And I'm going to spend most of the time today really talking about restoring the function, because this is where resilience and adaptation begin to come into play. And the four tracks through which the plan aims to meet these goals are the green resiliency and green infrastructure, programming and activities, civic engagement, and the historic landscape. So when it came to restoring the function, three sort of buckets of scenarios emerged from the planning process. The entire plan aims to bring activity, nature, and water into alignment, just as the original Olmsted plan did. And within nature, activity, and water, there are strategies that we're going to deploy to help restore the function of the park. So we've got our overall goals. We want to find the balance between nature and activity and water. And one of the ways that we do that is through the lens of community engagement and stakeholder input. So this is the typical way you see community engagement done, right? It's a digital survey, it's an email survey, it's a paper survey, and you get results. You get percentages and you get numbers, all of which is really helpful. But what this first survey did for us is made us realize that the responses that we got from the survey in terms of who was responding, who was engaging, didn't align with the users that we saw in the park every day. And we recognized very quickly that a digital engagement strategy wasn't necessarily going to be an equitable engagement strategy. And we had to go out into the park and begin to find ways to reach into these communities. So FDR Park, if you have ever been there, is one of the most authentically diverse places I have experienced in Philadelphia. It hosts a Southeast Asian market. It hosts a Latin American soccer league and market. There are folks from all over the city coming to this park to picnic, to play, and to get out in nature. And it is an experience that is really special to Philadelphia. But that's not what we were seeing in our digital survey. And so we began to recruit members of the community, regular park users, and began to work to develop relationships with them. And took that same survey and asked our park ambassadors to take it back to their communities. So who should be using the park that isn't? How do we reach folks in their churches, in their rec centers, in their living rooms? And our park ambassadors were real key to doing that. We also had some really traditional community meeting processes in the community, in the neighborhood, but with interpreters, with childcare, with food, and in an open house format to make it as easy as possible for anyone to drop in. And we worked with neighborhood groups to help, let's say, get out the vote and bring folks to these meetings. So as a result, you do all that, you do the surveys, and you get a list of stuff. And all of these things, some of them were already on the survey, a lot of them were write-ins. Really dramatically, basketball was a write-in element and shows up into the plan. And some of these items, we see over and over. But on your far left-hand side, you can see sort of the highest ranking item. Everyone wants hiking and biking trails. That's no surprise. Some of the things that were a surprise to us is the how many people wanted multi-use fields, where playgrounds ranked, how important it was for folks to have food and beverage opportunities at the park. So we're seeing this list of stuff, and we're seeing it ranked. But it's still a little bit like a diner menu, right? Like you can go to a diner, you have a list of stuff, but you don't necessarily know from this list. You could pick a couple things. It doesn't mean it's going to go on a plate or taste good together. It doesn't mean that it's going to make you feel good. And so during this initial phase, we have to figure out, how do we take these community requests, these desires, these preferences, and turn them into a plan? And the way that we start to do that is by testing different scenarios. And each of these scenarios that you see were never meant to be a plan. They were meant to maximize a point of view and then begin to see what people rank across maximizing nature, activity, and water consistently. We also began to ask folks to put their money where their mouth is. If we give you $5 or $10 FDR bucks, we want to see you start to vote on activity. We want to see you buy in, because it's really, really easy to go into a meeting and say, I want everything, right? Like a buffet, I'm going to have a little bit of everything. When in reality, that is not necessarily how good planning works. And that's not necessarily a park plan that can be sustainable. At the same time, we're talking to the community. We're also talking to stakeholders. So there are incredible organizations who have been running programming in FDR Park for decades and are incredible partners to the park. And we want to hear from them what their program needs and what the opportunity for their future is. We're talking to our electeds to understand what they are hearing from community members and residents. And then at the same time, as we saw on that first or second slide, this is a part of the city that is seeing a tremendous amount of change. This is a part of the city that is going to be significantly impacted by climate. And so we're trying to coordinate the work that the city planning office is doing, the Office of Sustainability, the Tree Philly Plan. We're trying to coordinate with all of these major stakeholders to make sure that whatever we propose can leverage plans and opportunities citywide. And then we also start to play, right? Not everyone speaks designer, not everyone speaks planner. And so we began to pull groups of diverse users together to understand when groups of people have to compromise, what kind of decisions do they make, right? And the reason we're mixing it up is because it's pretty simple. You put a bunch of birders together and say, what should happen here? And they say bird habitat. If you put a bunch of coaches together and you say, what should happen here? They're going to say this entire site should be serving youth sports. If you put, a bunch of vendors together, they'd maximize the market. So what we wanted to do was start to cut across those groups and see what diverse groups of people did when they had to plan together and when they had to make deals. And that's where the FDR Park planning box and these kind of workshop in a box sessions came from. So we've been collecting all of this community information. We've been collecting desires and future plans from city agencies and stakeholders. And the next step is a step that WRT really coined, and it's this idea of creative fitting, where you're matching these needs with the environmental opportunities that are existing in the park, the conditions on the ground, what's there, right? So the same way we saw in that early image, the golf course was placed in a low-lying area and it was flooded from the very first day. That is an example of where the fit wasn't aligned. And because that fit wasn't aligned, financially, the golf course failed. It failed programmatically. And so this is the same way that we want to think about any piece of the plan that we're proposing. How can we align a need with the conditions on site so that both public health, environmental health, and the financial health and sustainability of the park can be sustained? So in order to do that creative fitting process, we really have to understand where we are in the city. And so this image is a diagram of the historic shoreline of Philadelphia that's dashed. The heavy black line that you see right here is the border of FDR. Hollander Creek used to cut all the way through South Philadelphia and actually exited into the Delaware River Basin right at the park. The areas in pink are the parts of the park that are in the 100-year floodplain today. And these white areas are the edge of the park that sit outside of that floodplain. And this one white area here, which we're going to talk a lot about, also sits outside of the floodplain. So basically, we have a park that's functioning like a bathtub. So what does that really mean when you get down to it? Well, it means a couple of things for FDR, none of them great as the park currently stands. So first of all of these areas that are in light blue are experiencing groundwater flooding. Groundwater flooding occurs when the high tide in the Delaware is actually higher than the elevation of the ground in the park. And the water comes up through the surface of the park. So this means that you could have no rain for a year. And these parts of the park in light blue are always going to be wet. Groundwater flooding is tough to deal with. You can either say, look, I'm not going to build in that area, or I'm going to build in that area in a way that allows flooding. So for example, a boardwalk instead of an asphalt path. Or you can raise that area up and get out of the influence of groundwater. So those are your choices when it comes to groundwater flooding. The other flooding challenge we have at FDR Park is the fact that stormwater comes from Broad Street, Patterson Avenue, and the federal highway, I-95, and dumps directly onto FDR Park. So in large storm events, this park is not just inundated with the rainfall falling on it, it's inundated with stormwater coming off of some of the dirtiest roads in Philadelphia. And at the end of the day, that lands in the lakes and the water systems of this park. And so when we were looking at that slide earlier about water quality and conditions in the park, those pink lines representing stormwater are a major reason why that's happening. And then we talked about how this park sits low, right? We've got the rim of the bathtub here. The old Hollander Creek has been filled in, but still exits the park through a tide gate here. This tide gate essentially holds back the river from flooding the park, flooding our bathtub, right? At low tide, the tide gate opens and allows the park to drain out. Well, this tide gate is about 100 years old. We don't have the same climate, and we don't have a tide gate in the same operating condition as the day that it was put in. So the park is having less and less time to drain in between rain and flooding events. And so the tide gate is, 100 years old, not in great condition, as you can see. And when the tide gate doesn't work well, the park isn't able to drain. So fixing the tide gate would have incredible impacts on the inundation of FDR Park. So that dashed blue line here shows you where FDR Park floods today for the 1-year storm. And I say 1-year storm, but in reality, we are having that 1-year storm multiple times a year. With the tide gate repaired, that inundation area is significantly smaller. And so that helps the park not only drain after a storm, but it also keeps the park drier when we have frequent small storms, because we're creating time for the park to drain. So understanding where we are allows the design team to propose a solution or a diagram for the park that aligns the programmatic needs heard from the community, aligns the needs of the department, of the city, and also aligns with the opportunities available in the park. And so what emerged at FDR Park was a strategy of an urban edge and an ecological core. The ecological core is the blue-green heart of the park. This is the area that's always going to flood, and we're going to allow it to flood. We're going to encourage it, and we're going to encourage the habitat continuity in the space. The areas in pink are our urban or active edge. And this is where we want to place the programming like roads, parking, infrastructure, buildings, fields that we want to see stay high and dry, regardless of what the tide is and regardless of how often it's rained. And so this strategy looks at balancing digging out and cutting earth with filling it on the edge of the bathtub. So essentially all we're doing is taking that bathtub edge and thickening it so that it stays high and dry, and then allowing the ecological core of the park to manage and absorb stormwater and rain events. And also this is the area where we're going to see that groundwater flooding. So this is what that diagram looked like in 2019 when we translated it into a plan for FDR Park. So this plan made a couple changes on the eastern half of the park that really tried to reconcile and return the historic patterns that the Olmsted brothers set up through a couple simple moves. So first of all, removing parking from the ecological core and returning the woods and picnic sites and market area. Removing baseball fields and soccer fields from this portion of the park, removing the baseball and tennis fields from this portion of the park and returning that original green sward into a great lawn. It meant restoring some of the historic structures, but then relocating and reestablishing parking on that urban edge, reestablishing the athletic programming on that urban edge, and expanding the ecological core of the site to allow the park to have the blue-green sponge. So these spaces in the ecological core and the urban edge are organized into a series of rooms, and we're going to walk around a couple of those rooms now to show how they relate to the plan at large. So the first of these rooms is a wetland. This wetland is created in the southwest corner of the park. And if you recall the slide that was pink and showed how the park sits in the floodplain, there was this one portion in the southwest corner that was outside of the floodplain. And this is because in the 70s and 80s, the city of Philadelphia put waste from construction projects. So if they excavated for a wastewater treatment plant, they would put the clean dirt on this site. If they had construction waste from another site, it went to this site. So right now there's about a 30-acre, 40-foot tall hill in the southwest corner of FDR Park. Unfortunately, where they place that hill is also the traditional low point of the park. So we effectively have today a clog sitting on top of the drain of our bathtub. This wetland project will remove that clog. It will pick up that dirt and place it on other areas of the site where we want to see stay high and dry. It will also create an opportunity for new types of landscapes and new types of landscape experiences that aren't presently offered at FDR. We want to take Shedbrook Creek, which crosses through the western portion of the park and is kind of known as the ditch in the golf course, and expand that creek, reconnecting it to the floodplain, establishing a riparian buffer, and building out a sedge meadow, giving folks an opportunity to get out on the water in FDR Park and creating stronger hydrologic connections to the tidal wetland. So now when we talk about the urban edge, these are the parts of the park that we want to see stay high and dry. And one of the big moves on the urban edge is to really establish a strong gateway in the northeast corner of the park. If you recall, the northeast corner is where we have the subway station at Broad and Pattison. It's where we're going to have a new side path down Broad Street for cyclists. And we want to shift the balance of modes of transportation coming to FDR towards pedestrians, cyclists, and public transportations. And one of the ways that we're going to do that is by creating a stronger gateway that really acknowledges those needs and also creates a new center of gravity to the park around the Welcome Center, which we'll talk about in a little bit. We also have an opportunity now for a great lawn and real expansive 15 acres of space for passive play in FDR Park. And then importantly, athletic fields. These fields are interspersed with playgrounds, with concessions, with a 5K trail, and give Philadelphians an opportunity to not just enjoy and have access to high quality athletic amenities, but also to make sure that there's something for the whole family to enjoy. And so one of the really important things to talk about when we see these fields, and there's 12 multi-purpose fields. We've relocated the baseball and softball fields. We've added basketball and brought in tennis. It's really critical in FDR Park to deliver as much access to these fields as possible. We're making a tremendous investment, and that investment has to serve as many kids as we possibly can. And so the reason that we have chosen to both propose these fields, but also to propose performance turf fields, is because we're balancing equity and ecology. And we don't think that this is actually a choice. We think that performance turf fields deliver both of those. So our job is to deliver as much playing time to Philadelphians as possible. That's why these fields are going to be performance turf. That's why they're going to be lit. And we know that in terms of playing time, we would need 3 grass fields for every 1 performance turf field we have on site. And that wouldn't be in balance at FDR. 36 fields wouldn't be in balance, but we can have 12 fields and deliver the same amount of playing time. There's tremendous news and great research on how turf fields can be pervious when designed properly. We're excited because the space beneath the turf can be used to manage stormwater, and they don't require mowing, fertilizer, herbicide applications. We're also excited about the emerging technologies around the infill of turf fields. Traditionally, that was rubber and recycled rubber. We're seeing new products that use walnut shells, that use cork, that use coconut, and we think this could be viable options at FDR. And finally, turf fields are recyclable after the service life is up. And so that surface can be lifted up, can be recycled, and a new surface put into place over time. So we're not necessarily convinced that there is a choice between equity and ecology. We think that a well-designed modern field with modern materials and specifications can deliver both. So when we think about this plan, there's the stuff that's happening, but there's also the outcome of this stuff, and that's our network of benefits. And so how do we think about what that network of benefits might look like? And so in the case of the ecological core and the active edge, there's a real opportunity where these two pieces of the project are really closely related. So if you recall, we talked about using the soil from the wetland to elevate the active edge, to take dirt from one part of the park, lift it up, and move it to another part of the park that we want to see stay out of the influence of groundwater. When we do that, and you can see in this image right here, how the field is elevated. It creates space between the groundwater and the surface of the field under which we can do stormwater management. So now our fields can actively buffer Shedbrook Creek, the new sedge meadow we plan to build, the wetlands, and the treehouse woods from the stormwater that's coming off of Patterson Avenue. So in this way, the fields become a tool to help support and manage and sustain the ecological core. And there's a range of ways. So whether it's a field or a parking lot, it doesn't matter as much what's on the surface, it's how the subsurface is engineered. And as long as we have the space to do that, as long as we have lifted that surface and elevated it above the groundwater, we have the opportunity to really improve the stormwater management at this site. So as a result, what we'll have is stormwater management on the urban edge, under the parking lot, under the fields, under the courts. And then we'll have riparian buffers around our meadows, our wetlands, and our lakes. And together, these two systems, the active edge and the ecological core, can work together to help improve water quality at this park and to help buffer our most sensitive natural areas from the stormwater that's coming from Broad Street, I-95, and Patterson Avenue. So these are the thoughts behind where the plan was in 2019. So we released the plan in May of 2019, and we began working with the city of Philadelphia to shape and scope the first phase of design. We were at the very beginning of that process when the pandemic hit in 2020. So this is a great opportunity, we think, to talk about resilience and the ability and how the ability of a system to bounce back and recover in the face of disruption applies to FDR Park and applies to the planning process. So this was public space in 2020 in Philadelphia. You had neighborhoods where the fields and courts were locked. You had playgrounds that were made off limits. You had a lot of the systems that served youth and family unavailable to the people who needed them most. At the same time, this is the pandemic in FDR Park. The golf course is closed, the concessionaire has taken their stuff, they have left town, and the land that was the golf course has emerged into a mosaic of species, some of them invasive, some of them not. But it has also emerged into a place for people in the know to begin to be able to get out in nature away from the city. And it was an incredible resource for folks at a time when they really, really needed it. But there were other pieces that were changing behind the scenes as well. First Tee was a golf concessionaire at FDR Park, and they were providing tremendous kids programming and youth-oriented programming at FDR Park. And the plan really accommodated them through a driving range. And that was in the plan in 2019. But during the pandemic, they left FDR Park and they've chosen to make investments in other parts of the city. At the same time, Bel Air Manor, which sits in FDR Park, is one of the oldest structures in South Philadelphia and should be listed on the historic register. And knowing that, it made sense to give that a more significant landscape buffer to connect that site to the agricultural story of the of that landscape and of that place. During 2020 and 2021, the city's updating its official hazard mitigation plan, and it includes key projects from the ecological core as high priority elements in the plan. And in 2022, we're also working with the city to conduct an audit with ecologists and biologists to help understand more clearly, a year or two removed from the closure of the golf course, what high potential habitat do we have on the site? What existing habitat is high quality? And we needed the time away from the operation of the golf course, away from the 80 years of herbicide and pesticide application that's taken on that site, to begin to understand what is there and what might emerge. And so the result of that audit helped us understand what is high quality now and what might be high quality in the future. And so here's the result of that mapping. So the areas in orange are areas where, if you went out in the spring of 2022, you would have seen high quality open and emergent wetland. That's in orange. You would have seen some great green forested habitat, some pink is the shrub habitat. And that little shaded area are areas where the ecologists and biologists said, hey, look, this isn't really something special today, but with the right management techniques, with the right planting techniques, you could develop high quality habitat in these sites. And so when we looked at this with the 2019 plan laid beneath it, we recognized that in a lot of places, the design team took a good guess and got it absolutely correct. We see the ecological core areas in the historic park are offered up as potential high quality habitat. We see the riparian edge along Shedbrook Creek, but we also see a few areas where we have some conflict, most notably this area right here, where we have high quality forest habitat, and this area right here, where we've proposed an overlook hill, but we actually have some wetlands. And then finally, this third section right through here. So we went back to the design team and we said, hey, look, you need to think about this habitat. You need to think about how people are changing their use in the park. You need to think about Bel Air Manor. And you need to think about what opportunity does this plan present now that we're not trying to accommodate golf. And so the outcome is really an expansion, a further expansion of the ecological core. So you can see here how the ecological core has grown to encompass that high quality forested area as well. And so what we have in the 2022 FDR Park Plan update is a landscape where about 60% of the site sits in the ecological core. This is consistent with other landscapes in the Philadelphia park system. You also see that about 42 acres of the site is dedicated to fields and courts, that we've been able to expand the original emergent wetland to 23 acres. We now have a 33-acre tidal wetland here. A wildflower hill moves to this site, and we've added another nature playground that connects this forested wetland. We heard that Philadelphians appreciated the opportunity to be out in nature and heard that folks wanted to connect with the city and a municipal park landscape in a different way. And so this adjustment to the plan aims to do those things. And so I'm going to walk really quickly what the phases are in the planning process and where we are, and get into a little bit how we're trying to connect the ideas about resilience and adaptation from a system scale down to a project scale. So there's 3 phases of this park that are in progress right now. The first phase is the gateway phase. That is on that northeast corner of the park where we're really trying to rebalance the center of gravity. We're really trying to connect with other modes of transportation. Then the area, 100 acres of the nature phase, that's area B. And we saw the tidal wetland for that phase go into construction this summer. And then finally area C, where the fill in the soil from the tidal wetland are being moved up to lay the groundwork for our picnic and play site. So I'm going to start with the gateway phase. It's 3 projects that are all real test cases for us to transition resilience practices from the sort of broad planning system scale into individual project scale. This is our opportunity to improve the visitor experience for park users. People said they wanted new amenities, they wanted food and beverage, they wanted to be able to extend their stay, they wanted clean bathrooms, they wanted a place for their kids to play. And we're trying to address those needs in this phase. It's also a chance to pilot new standards and practices and strengthen the park's connection to Broad Street through bike and pedestrian infrastructure. So the first project is the Welcome Center. This is an adaptive reuse of a historic guardhouse stable that has sort of 3 programmatic functions. The first function is to provide co-working space to all of the incredible park stakeholders that bring this place to life. So anybody from the Friends of FDR to the Southeast Asian vendors, to some of the sports teams, can have touchdown space, can use the conference room, can make copies, can connect with their constituents in the guardhouse here. No one has to be doing this work from the back of their truck or their phone. We want to provide opportunities for those stakeholders to meet each other, to collaborate, and to also feel like they have a home at FDR. We also have an info center, a chance for visitors to have a beachhead that helps them get oriented to this really large 348-acre park. We have a courtyard for food and beverage vending opportunities. And then finally, a community meeting space in the back of this venue, in the back of this site. Critically, though, the Welcome Center is also a resilience hub. This project was being designed during the pandemic, during a year where we saw hurricanes, we saw flooding, we saw heat waves, and we really wanted to think about how we can take an investment and make sure that this space helps the city provide a continuity of service delivery. So we moved the utilities, the building services to the 3rd floor. We have the capacity for emergency generation on the site. This site can operate as a heating and cooling center. Our catering kitchen is perfect to also do emergency food distribution. And the program spaces are indoors and outdoors because we saw our city really have a strong demand for these flexible type spaces during the pandemic. And so this is a historic building, but it's working very hard to anticipate the needs of the 21st century. The next project, this project is gonna open next summer, is the Anna C. Verna Playground. This is where we challenge the design team to pursue really aggressively inclusive design. That there's nothing in this park that is off limits to any type of user. It's just their level of risk and adaptation that would allow them to move through these sites. We're also trying to integrate horticulture and nature into playgrounds, and then pilot an alternative to the traditional rubber safety surface. So we're using corkine on this site, which is a renewable material. It is made of cork and it is pervious. It is our hope that when we pilot these practices and materials here, that they can become part of the standards and systems in the rest of the PPR system. This is our mega swing, which we're super excited about. And then the 3rd project in the Gateway phase is our Gateway Plaza. And this is where we're really trying to think about the pedestrian connections and the relationships between FDR Park and some of the places around it. And so the plaza sits at the intersection of Broad and Pattison, right where the subway is. And this is a huge area that sees a tremendous amount of foot traffic, particularly on game days. But we also want to make sure, since it is at the edge of the park, that it can function as a node in the cooling network. So it is a plaza that is designed as a series of groves. The groves have seating, they are shady, and they have misters. We also center the bicycle and pedestrian experience and have an infrastructure here that is adaptive and flexible, making it easy to pop up different kinds of events and activities, because we don't believe that any of these spaces have the luxury of being just one thing. The nature phase. This is 100 acres of the larger ecological core, and it started construction this summer with the wetland. This is a 33-acre tidal wetland that is being built by the Philadelphia Airport. The Philadelphia Airport is doing an expansion that causes several fragmented small wetlands to be filled. This site is where they received federal permission to mitigate for those wetlands that they're filling. So they're taking small, low-quality wetlands and replacing it with a 33-acre wetland. This wetland will result in, this project will repair the tide gate, which, if you recall, was critically important to flooding in the park. It will add 7,000 native trees, 1,900 shrubs, and it provides the 400,000 cubic yards of clean fill that we need for the urban edge to raise those areas out of the influence of groundwater so that we can do stormwater management below them. And I think really critically, a tidal wetland is also a locally rare habitat. So it's going to be really special that this is on site at FDR. So just quickly to talk a little bit more about how that works. So you can see the area here. This is the tidal wetland that the Philadelphia Airport needs to create and is presently building on site. This is being built on that area where construction waste had been dumped during the 70s and 80s. That area is being returned to a low point, and that hill is being moved to this part of the park. Eventually, we're going to take that ground and use it to establish our picnic and play site. Picnic and play is the first piece of the urban edge that we're developing, and it includes 5 multi-purpose fields. So those can be used for football or soccer. They're artificial turf, they're lit. We're adding basketball courts, a playground and spray ground, concessions, indoor space for teams to be able to have meetings. We're relocating and reorganizing the baseball and softball from the eastern half of the park. It's doing the same with the tennis so that this entire site can operate almost like a rec center with later hours, with its own entrance, and really be able to maximize the utilization and ability for Philadelphians to get out and play on these amenities. So you can begin to see what that experience might be like. And again, there's stormwater management under these courts, under these fields, and the entire landscape, both the ecological core and the urban edge, is connected by the Franklin 5K. That's that multi-use trail that you see in the middle of the drawing. So in order to have the best possible question and answer period, I thought what I would do is do a little bit of FDR myth busting, because there's a lot of, this is a complicated project. There's a lot of phases. There's a lot of players involved. And I think it's really important to at least get the facts on the table. So one of the things that we hear is that FDR Park is being destroyed to build a FIFA stadium. That image you see on the right-hand side is the link. That is the stadium for the World Cup when it comes to Philadelphia. However, very exciting, Philadelphia may, or FDR Park may have a role as a training site during the World Cup. So in 2021, the city had to put forward 6 potential training sites. These are locations that a team is able to practice on during their time in the city at the World Cup, and then return to whatever they were before after that training period is over. So FDR Park was put forward as one of these based on the master plan. However, FIFA hasn't selected a training site yet, and there are no plans to build a stadium in FDR Park. Another one we hear, the airport wetland project is clear cutting an old growth forest. So old growth forests are, in the eastern US, they're typically forests that are about 150 to 500 years in age. They're forests where there is not human disturbance, where people haven't been through. And so I think it's really important. I wanted to share this 1981 aerial so you can get a sense of FDR Park in the past. This is the area of the wetland that's being built. You can see that it's still a very active construction waste site in 1981. You can also see that the canopy, even on the golf course, is relatively small. We don't have an old growth forest here, but what we do have is a tree canopy that is being impacted by climate change. It's being impacted by frequent flooding. It's being impacted by hotter summers. It's being impacted by invasive pests. And so we have to begin today to replace that canopy with species that are adapted and adjusted for the future. And this is something that the Philadelphia's leaders at Parks and Rec are working with the Forest Service on to really think about what are the trees that we plant today and pick today that will be able to be here and survive the conditions in the 21st century. Another one we hear, there shouldn't be any fields at FDR Park because kids can play in their own neighborhoods. This is South Philadelphia, where in the 2020 census, we learned there's 21,000 kids from the age of, actually, to read 5 to 17 in South Philadelphia, right? We said this is a growing neighborhood in terms of families. There are only 10 public fields large enough to be shared for either football or soccer at a full size. And only one of those is striped with performance turf. So not every kid can play in their neighborhood. Here's a big one. The soils in FDR Park are contaminated. If you let your kid play on these future fields, you're in trouble. The reality is, it's been clean construction fill that has been dumped on that wetland site. And during the engineering and planning phase, there were over 100 soil tests that were conducted in a footprint of that proposed wetland. And throughout construction, they continue to test the soil. The contractor is required to remove any soil or material that doesn't meet the standards. So as a result of the wetland project, we will actually have a park with cleaner soil than we do today. Here's a good one. They are paving over FDR Park. So it's true, the park plan adds 800 parking spaces to FDR Park. But what it also does is it removes existing lots that are sitting within the ecological core and adds new lots on the urban edge that are designed to manage stormwater, right? We talk about when we raise it up, we can have stormwater management underneath it. Today, there is no stormwater management happening on those parking lots. Most of the parking that is added in terms of number of spaces comes when we extend the park loop road to the western half of the site and we add the bike lane and we add on-street parking. That's where most of those spaces come from. And while we all want people to ride their bikes, we all want connections to the subway. That's why we're starting our work in the northeast corner of the park, closest to the subway. The reality is 80% of the users are arriving to the park via vehicle. We have a responsibility to create an FDR Park that works for everyone, not just folks who are able to get here by bike or walk. There has been no engagement since the pandemic. The Fairmount Park Conservancy and Parks and Rec have continued to conduct joint engagement activities. Just in 2022, we've done over 50 hours of in-person engagement through online open houses, monthly walk and talks with Maura McCarthy and the park director, Justin DeBaradinis, and hosting regular public programming in FDR Park. And I think the biggest acknowledgement that engagement has occurred and that folks are listening is the change to the plan that happened between 2019 and 2022. That was a direct response, not just to the changing conditions on the ground, but to the appetite that we saw folks have for spaces within the ecological core. Here's one. The plan is destroying the only truly wild space in South Philadelphia. FDR Park is a municipal park. It is a human-created park. It is land that has been managed and changed and used for humans. It is not a wildlife refuge. And the very fact that this park exists is because there's a tide gate, because there was a decision to put fill on this marsh at one point, because herbicides and pesticides created the golf course and have managed the golf course. And we see that this park continues to be shaped and changed by humans. And then finally, and this is where I'll end it, I think this is the biggest myth of all, we can just do nothing at FDR Park. And I think for the this is an image from NOAA that's showing what a 5-foot sea level rise is going to look like in South Philadelphia. And I think for the generations of kids that are here today and that will be using these park and these improvements over the next 50 or 80 years, that doing nothing isn't necessarily an equitable solution. So with that, I will conclude the talking portion. I will also welcome Maura McCarthy, who has joined us as well.
Thanks so much, Allison. Let me remove the spotlight. And welcome, Maura. Thank you for joining us. We introduced you, even though you weren't here before, we introduced you previously, but thanks for joining us. So that was a great presentation. It was very comprehensive. We got a lot of information there. And as you might imagine, the Q&A box is sort of lighting up with lots of questions. I want to pitch those to you, but sort of start with a couple of things. Just some basic facts. Someone is asking whether the biological ecological audit that you mentioned is publicly available, or is it shareable? Is that something that could be, that the public can see?
I think we shared that. So the result that we have, it was a really simple study, show us where we have high quality habitat today and where we could have high quality habitat in the future. And that was that image that I shared, because our goal was to, as quickly as possible, adapt the biology and the ecology that we saw on site and make an adaptation to the plan. So it was a really simple study. It wasn't necessarily like a species inventory. It was a simple question: what is good now and what could be great in the future?
And I guess that gets to, thank you for that. That gets to, I guess, one of the other questions, which is someone was, really appreciated the comprehensiveness of your presentation and asked if that could be shared with the public. And I just want to re-mention what I said at the beginning. All of the CC Run seminars this is being recorded. It will be posted to the CC Run website. And so you can go back and watch this presentation again. And I guess to that extent, we can see, folks can go advance to that portion and see that map that you presented.
And these updates are also available on the Conservancy's website at myphillypark.org.
Oh, great. Okay, so they can
and as hand cards and signage in the park with a QR code. So if you're walking about and you want to learn more, that signage is there, and most of the park staff should have palm cards and flyers they can give you for your questions as well.
Great. There was also a request for your link on when you were talking about the permeable turf fields. There was a link on the bottom of your slide, which is a link that I think I know well because that's a conference presentation that I think I gave. But can you share that link with us?
What's the best way?
Just go back, right? Yeah.
Yeah, maybe what we can do is, that's the best way to do that in this context. I think, Nikki, do you have a way of sharing that link? If Allison shares it with you, can you share it with the attendees right now?
Yes.
Okay, so why don't you just put it in the chat, and we can go forward with that.
All right.
While you're doing that, I just want to make another connection for folks, because you mentioned that one of those buildings would be a resilience hub. And actually, in this seminar series on February 2nd, 2022, we did an entire session on resilience hubs and in other cities and how they work. And so I think that'll be a really interesting sort of connection for folks who are interested in resilience hubs. There was a question about whether, I guess, one of the myths that maybe, or I don't know if it's a myth or not a myth, but one of the sort of controversial issues that has come up among the public is that the fields might actually only be accessible by paying a fee, and that therefore, there'll be some exclusivity as to who can use the fields. Can you say anything about that? Is that in fact true?
We hear that a lot, and I think it's really important to know that this project is City of Philadelphia Parks and Rec land. It is being operated by the City of Philadelphia Parks and Recreation Department, and they do not charge fees to youth serving organizations who are interested in using athletic fields. Now, we do know, and we know from talking to a lot of local coaches, a lot of local teams, that being able to host a tournament is a critical opportunity for local teams. It helps them build up their profile. It helps them raise money, and it allows them to avoid an expensive out-of-state trip to another city's tournament. So we know that there's an interest from local teams in being able to host tournaments on this site. We also know that youth serving organizations, Philadelphia-based, play for free. Adults, there's a fee, but adults are paying that fee all over the city right now to get on fields.
So, I mean, I guess if I were just wanted to take my kids down there and play, and it was a time when there wasn't a tournament going on, I could access it for free. But you're saying I could just go on the field and play, or is I clarify that point?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So all of Philadelphia's fields through Parks and Rec go through a permitting system. If there is no one holding the permit at a given time, fields are accessible for free play. So that's without any fee. So I can't think of anywhere in the Philadelphia system where you and your family are going to be charged to kick a ball around a field when no one else is using it.
Okay. Let's see. So there was a question about the extent to which the design of the park took into consideration some of the projections of sea level rise in the area. And
Yep.
I know you talked about climate risks, but you didn't mention specifically sea level rise.
Yeah, so we were really, really lucky in this planning process that the William Penn Foundation said, you know what, if you're doing a plan for FDR Park, here's an additional investment that we want you to make to consider a couple things. And we were able to do an in-depth hydrology study for FDR Park that allowed us to test different programmatic and different grading scenarios against PWD's projections for climate change. So we were able to say, well, look, if you do nothing, and I think we can all see from that NOAA image what you have. If you repair the tide gate, and if you elevate the urban edge to, I think it's like +8 or +9 from in terms of the contour, this is what changes. And so we were able to look at how do you balance cut and fill on the site? How do you create that green sponge? And then what does it take to keep that active urban edge high and dry? And our basis for that were PWD's planning predictions.
Great. And so when you talked about the groundwater flooding, so the finished grade, the proposed finished grade will be high enough that even in a future with a higher Delaware River, the sort of likelihood of groundwater flooding will be in the areas that are not supposed to flood, of course,
Right.
Is low.
Exactly. So we have to think when we're getting any capital dollars from the state or from the city, what does this have a 50-year lifespan? And so that's what we're really looking at as sort of a baseline threshold for elevating that urban edge where we're making those investments.
Great. There are a couple of questions. I'm going to try to put them together about sort of like net changes, right? Like now versus the future. So net changes in terms of the number of trees in the park, or net changes in terms of like the acreage of wetlands in the park, or net changes in terms of the size of the 100-year floodplain in the park. Is there any sort of information you can give us on any of those things?
I mean, I think, sure. We are targeting I think we can talk about programmatic amenities and sort of the net changes there. We can share with you that we are thinking about 60% of the site being managed as natural lands, which is consistent in the rest of the city. And I think we're still having conversations with folks around, when we think about that natural lands, how much of it is forest, how much of it is tidal, how much of it should be meadow, right? Because we want to make sure that as we're thinking through these habitats, that they have that they are able to function as a habitat type, but also that we're providing a diversity of habitats and habitat experiences on the site. So can I tell you today how many trees there's going to be in 20 years when we have this plan done? No, but what I can tell you is that the addition of 7,000 native trees on a 33-acre site that was construction fill is a net gain. That 1,900 shrubs on a site that was full of construction debris and Siberian elms, that's a net gain. And I think everyone in Philadelphia experienced how quickly nature and natural processes can create something that is beautiful and exciting and resilient. When we saw a golf course with 80 years of herbicide and pesticide application start to emerge as a new type of landscape for Philadelphians. So if we can think about what happens when we don't try, let's imagine really quickly what we can do when we actually see that process and try with intent and science behind us.
Yep. And what about the floodplain questions?
Look, we're under the same requirements that everyone else making changes in the city has to deal with. If you make a change in the floodplain, propose a change in the floodplain, you have to demonstrate that you're not making impacts on your neighbors, and you have to do that work before you're able to move your project forward. So we know that we're going to have multiple conversations about the floodplain, and we know, and we're very happy to be having those conversations broadly with all of our partners surrounding us to make sure that the investments and the shifts that are coming to South Philadelphia are happening in a coordinated fashion. But in FDR Park itself, we're looking at balancing our cut and fill and delivering a site that does not create impacts to our neighbors.
And I guess there's a sort of, just building off of that, there was a question about the wetland, the sort of international airport wetland restoration site, and whether any, to the best I saw, I think you showed that a lot of that was happening on that big hill of fill. But I guess the question is whether any of, like, how that decision was made to position the wetland where it is, and whether there were any existing wetlands that are being replaced by this restoration site.
Yeah, so that decision happened, and it started years ago as the Philadelphia airport began to look for wetland sites. And I think anyone who is involved with compensatory mitigation knows you can pay. When it comes to mitigation, you can pay into a fund. So that's called an in lieu fee. Or you can do permittee responsible mitigation, where you build the wetlands yourself and provide that value somewhere else. So the Philadelphia airport could have done their project and gotten their wetland mitigation without FDR Park. But this is one of those projects that we saw as a real opportunity, because it was close enough to the airport that the ecological benefits are happening in the same area that they're being mitigated for. So that's important. The second thing that's important is it takes a hill of construction waste that is sitting on the low point of the site, the clog that's sitting on the drain that is our bathtub of FDR. And it takes that hill and it says, it removes it. It creates a locally rare tidal wetland, and then delivers that fill so that we can use it at the urban edge and create programs and activities that stay high and dry and have the capacity for stormwater management beneath them. So we were very excited when the airport had that opportunity. Parks and Rec was very excited when the airport had that opportunity, because it's a win-win that solves multiple problems and enables a future for FDR, not to mention the fact that they're fixing the tide gate. So those factors together are huge wins in the future of the park.
And generate a significant amount of funds towards the master plan. And I guess there was another question here, which is for the rest of the project, are there commitments of funding that have been made, or how do they know that some of these features will actually get built?
Sure, this is a project that is not going to happen overnight. I don't know if there's any 348-acre site that sees an overnight renovation, but we're really proud that the first $30 million on the gateway phase, the welcome center, the playground, and the plaza, those are all going to be complete by 2024 and are already committed and well underway. We also have funds committed for the picnic and play site. And overall, $90 million have been committed towards FDR Park and towards this plan to date. And that's really fast in this city, considering we revealed the plan in May of 2019, and we're going to be cutting ribbons on projects in 2023.
That's exciting. Two questions, I guess, onto the permeable surfaces, right? So there was you talked about perhaps using some ecologically friendly, let's say, aggregate materials for the artificial turf. And are these just ideas, or are there actually commitments, like there would be in, say, a LEED project, a commitment to doing that? And I guess a related question is about the 800 parking spaces, the new parking areas that you're talking about. Is there any opportunity for making those permeable asphalt, permeable concrete, just sort of consistent with what you're doing on the turf fields?
Yeah, 100%. I think that's why we view moving the lots to the urban edge and out of the core of the park as a great move, not just for the pedestrian and visitor experience, but also for a stormwater experience, because we've got a lot of lots that are sitting next to our lakes and streams that have no stormwater management. So, yep, we're absolutely going to be looking at managing stormwater off of our lots. As far as our artificial turf fields go, we are currently investigating a range of materials. Piloting new materials is really important to this plan. That's why we worked long and hard with Parks and Rec to find an alternative to the rubber safety surface that's standard in playgrounds, and use corkine on this first phase. So I would imagine that same commitment to piloting materials that are both ecologically sound and high functioning will continue on future phases of the park.
Great. And I mean, sort of extending that commitment into maintenance of something like the Great Lawn. There's a question, is it actually feasible to maintain it without herbicides or pesticides? Is it, what are the sort of ways that you're going to sort of carry through that philosophy into the management of some of these more manicured parts of the park?
Yeah, so the Great Lawn is natural grass, it's trees, it's going to be a site that sees events. And we know that there are examples of progressive management patterns all over the country. For example, Boston Commons, which gets a tremendous amount of foot traffic, has been managing its lawn for a long time without the use of pesticides and herbicides. And so we know that there are ways and that there are practices in doing that and doing it well. And so there's no reason that the logic that applies to the turf fields can't also apply to the natural grass fields. And luckily in Philly, we tend to be a couple decades behind everyone else. So the research is already there. The practices are already there. We just have to go out and learn how to put those in play for our own landscapes.
Thank you. So, there's a question, this is an interesting question that, you spent a lot of time talking about the challenges that stormwater management pose for the park. And the question is phrased like, is this a park problem? Or is it, in the case of stormwater originating on surrounding streets, is it a PWD? Is it a water department problem? Or I guess you could extend the question to say, is it an I-95 problem? Is it,
Yeah.
Has the design sort of gone above and beyond to address a problem that's originating outside the boundaries of the park? And why was that? Is this going to actually decrease the incentive for doing things to address the source of those problems?
100%. I think, like many answers you'll hear us give today, it's a both and, right? So we know that large infrastructure changes take time. And we know that we have to and have the opportunity to manage what happens within the boundaries of the park. But we also know that Broad Street is identified as a potential green street. We know that there are opportunities for stormwater management on Broad Street that lots of folks are looking at. We know that I-95 is going to have to be rebuilt. And when it is rebuilt, it's not going to be possible or legal to straight pipe the stormwater directly onto FDR Park. And we actually see that reconstruction of 95 is an opportunity to bring the mitigation from that highway into the park and to benefit the park. So I will say, yes, we're having all of those conversations, but those conversations are long-term. Those are infrastructure investments, but we know that we can control what's happening in the near term horizon and want to be able to do that.
Thank you. So interesting question here, and I think you've addressed some of this, but maybe you should, maybe it'd be good if you could kind of review what you said. So the question is really, some of the active recreation is on the west side of the park, and that includes some of the areas that became natural when the golf course closed down, and it also seems like it overlaps with some of the areas that were identified as high quality habitat. And so the question is, since there was no high quality habitat or any sort of natural areas on the east side of the park, why was the active restoration moved to the meadows instead of sort of the east side of the park along Broad Street?
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about that. So if we place this into context, the planning effort, the western half of the park was a golf course. That is an active recreational use. The eastern half of the park is a historic park. It is a historic landscape, and we are trying to do our best to restore the historic bones and framework of that landscape. We are also recognizing that parts of that landscape are low-lying and will flood. And we have the opportunity to remove some of the fields, the courts, and the parking from those low-lying areas in the eastern half of the site and relocate them onto the western half of the park, which is the footprint of the old golf course. And so that's where the planning effort began. And you're right, there are fragments of high quality habitat that are going to be impacted by the picnic and play areas. But I think what we can share and what the diagram shows is that the areas that are being impacted are far smaller than the areas of high quality habitat and landscapes and wetlands that we're going to create through the implementation of the ecological core. So really, this plan, nothing has a perfect solution, and we're always trying to bring into balance activity, nature and water, natural factors and cultural factors, and find the best possible outcome for all of Philadelphians through those decisions.
Thank you. I'm struggling because it seems like no matter how many questions we answer, there's always more than 30 in the
It's a complicated plan.
So here's a question probably from someone like me, a water resources engineer.
Okay.
So there's a question about whether there will be a hydrologic and hydraulic analysis, to I guess to support any kind of FEMA application, that would look at the physical changes and the widening of the creek, the wetlands, the tide gates, et cetera, and the impact that that'll have on the regulatory flood map of the region. I'm guessing the answer is yes, but I wonder if you could talk anything about that. Yeah,
I think what I would share is just because we're a park and just because we're a city doesn't mean we're exempt from any of the regulatory requirements and other user might experience. I think the difference is we see those requirements as opportunities. We see mitigation as an opportunity on this site. We see the floodplain as an opportunity on this site. So we are trying to look at it through the lens of opportunity, but we have the same requirements that anyone else would who's making changes in the floodplain.
Okay, back to use of the playing fields. And you, again, you may have mentioned this, but maybe it would be helpful to just review who gets to schedule and sort of enforce the use of the playing fields. And like, for example, for some reason, the question is focusing on ultimate frisbee and cricket. And I don't know if that's a specific thing because there's a specific set of criteria about what sports get to be, you know, what teams, what types of sports can be used on the field, but anything on that would be helpful.
Yeah, I would say that questions about permitting or the permitting form and how it's not working with folks, reach out and let us know and we'll pass it along to Parks and Rec. But again, these fields are operated and permitted by Parks and Recreation and their recreation staff. So they're the ones that are best able to align the resources with the end users.
Okay. On the issue of birds, and you know, obviously we're on the East Coast and this is the East Coast flyway. What provisions have been made in the design to specifically, you know, attract or accommodate birds? And, you know, is there, are there any special features to the ecological restoration? Any, you know, features that you might even be integrating into the sports fields that would make them more accommodating for birds?
This is, interestingly enough, FDR Park is an important bird area. It probably has the second most diversity of species of any park. And this was a count that was done from 2017 or 2018, back when the golf course was still functioning. So this park has always had a real interest for birders. Despite the light from 95, from the casino, from the stadium district, somehow the site is still, and it's a highly urbanized site. It's still a great location for birds and birders. And so we're really focused on this site with, again, a diversity of landscape types. This tidal wetland is a rare landscape for our region, and we think it will be important for migrating birds. We are also looking at other types of landscapes, whether it is forested wetlands or small area of upland forest where you have these teeny tiny pockets, so that we can maximize the diversity, we can maximize the edge condition, and we can work with partners to really shape that species list to be most attractive to wildlife. We're also, if you check the master plan, we are focused on lighting that is dark skies compliant. We are focused on bird safe practices when it comes to buildings and structures and glazing. Now, we're pretty much just adapting and reusing existing structures, but we can still take some measures there to make sure that our buildings are also safe for birds. So we know that it's something that makes this park special. And it is our goal to not only enhance the habitat, but also enhance people's ability to access and connect with that habitat through trails, through overlooks, through boardwalks. So it's not just, it's for the birds. It's also for the people who love the birds or may come to love the birds.
Well, sort of going beyond birds, there's a question about whether sort of threatened and endangered species and whether the study that you mentioned previously looked at things like presence of monarch butterflies, eagle nests, other features. And, you know, I guess sort of direct question, are there any endangered species known in the park right now? And is there anything that can be done to sort of create habitat for those species in the future?
Yeah, so through the work that the airport did in their wetland process, they had to go through a federal permitting process, which included an inventory for invasive species, or not invasive, but threatened or endangered species. And so there were a few types of plants and, importantly, a turtle. So if you went out on site this past summer, you would have seen some fencing that was turtle protection fencing. So as they move between habitats, seasonally, the fencing was put up to keep them and make sure that they didn't access areas that were going to be disturbed by construction. This is the any process that we go through in the floodplain, or anytime we have state or federal dollars, we have to do that initial assessment and audit to make sure that any species that is residing or present on site is accounted for, and that we're managing it appropriately.
Great. And there's a couple of questions about, I think are motivated, our audience is thinking about climate change writ large, including carbon sequestration. And so there's a question, I'm going to try to integrate a couple of questions. One is whether there's been any discussion about carbon sequestration and sort of embodied carbon in the park. But then I think there's a more specific question about sort of compensation for some of the older trees in the park, and whether the number of new trees that are being proposed are in any way sort of equivalent in terms of their ability to sequester carbon. Has there been any sort of detailed study on that?
We have not done a detailed study on carbon sequestration, but we do, and embodied carbon, but we do talk about it a lot around the adaptive reuse of our historic building structures. The most carbon positive building that we're going to have is a building that already exists. And so we want to think really carefully about what are the buildings and how do we reuse things, and how do we care for things that have already seen, that investment in carbon. When it comes to tree species, there is definitely embodied sequestered carbon in trees, but we also know that grasslands, which grow really, really quickly, have the ability to also sequester significant amounts of carbon. Wetlands sequester significant amounts of carbon. So it's not just a trees or no trees conversation. I think it's a real conversation about how do these landscapes serve the humans that use a municipal park? How will that support humans in the future? And how do we reconcile that with the natural processes that take place and occur? So we're always, again, trying to find the balance between activity, nature, and water, and carbon sequestration is a piece of that.
And, similar to the way that you kind of carefully position the wetlands in the places that made most hydrologic sense, was there any attempt to work around some of the more mature trees in the park, just kind of preserve those trees?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That 2022 plan update was really driven by a desire to preserve a couple key areas of forested wetland where we have high quality trees and high quality species. And now, again, we have to keep all of this in perspective. High quality in Philadelphia might be 50 or 60 years old, which is hardly an old growth forest that has tremendous ecological value, but we know that these spaces have tremendous personal value and emotional value to people. And we've made adjustments in the plan to begin to accommodate those. But we are also just as quickly planting the canopy that we're going to need to have for the future, because as we have more groundwater flooding, as we have hotter summers, the trees that were planted 40, 60, 80 years ago are going to continue to decline. And we need to have new species, up and coming species, the next forest planted alongside of them, ready to go. We cannot just treat the forests we have today as if it were frozen in time, because we know that the climate is changing around it.
Well, in fact, that ties into another question that we had, which is, so what I interpret what you just said is it's about the numbers of trees and the age, sort of like the distribution of age, right? So you need to have a lot of younger trees so that we have the next generation of forests. But I guess this question is whether there's any attention to future warming that informed the specific species, right? I know Philadelphia is sort of at an interesting latitude in between two different forest regions, but are you looking to some of the more southern species?
Yep, this work has been ongoing, I would say, in the Philadelphia Parks and Rec Department for maybe the last 5 or 10 years in partnership with the Forest Service to understand and to test and then pilot the species that our landscape is going to need in the future. So in some cases at FDR, we know that we need to have some species that are more resistant to being able to have wet feet, to sit in this groundwater flooding from time to time. Citywide, we know that we need to have species that are better able to accommodate periods of drought, that are better able to accommodate inundation, that are better able to accommodate extreme heat. And so the Forest Service and Parks and Recreation Natural Lands team have really been testing and piloting these sites citywide, and we're going to be have the benefit of that research and how we think about plant selection at FDR. And I would say that's primarily for the trees, but it's true across all of the landscapes and all of the planting. We have to really be thinking about what are the future conditions.
Right. Yeah, and there was a question earlier about the sort of chemical composition of that fill, and you mentioned that the contractor, you've done already a number of tests, and the contractor will be required to do more tests and remove anything that's contaminated. But it sounds like that's in the area where you're moving fill from one place to the other. What about the former golf course? I mean, has there been testing on herbicide and pesticides in those soils? And what would be the fate of any kind of contamination in the golf course area if you found that?
So look, anytime that we're proposing to do substantial excavation in an area, that's one of the due diligence activities that take place, is to understand what that soil is, not just from a chemical composition, but also from a structural composition. We're obviously the goal of this park is obviously to create a healthy place for the future. But I think what's really exciting is most of the golf course is not going to be excavated. It's actually going to be filled. So we're going to be taking that clean fill and putting it on top of the existing ground in the golf course.
Got it. This is more of a technical question, but maybe in your research, in designing the park, you've come across it. So the individual is mentioning that some astroturf is much hotter, can be very warm, and that could actually deter a variety of species. So I'm wondering if any of your research on some of these, these alternative materials being used in turf, if these are cooler turf surfaces, if you know, or any research you have on sort of temperature, heat island impacts of astroturf.
Yeah, I think astroturf is a trade name, and it's a product from the 60s and 70s. Astroturf is like saying a Corvair is the same thing as a Tesla, right? So astroturf is not the same thing as the performance turf that we're talking about today. So there are products and modifications that can be made to help those fields remain cooler than they would than like a 1960s, 1970s fields. There are modifications that make them also more permeable. So there's a number of things, and these fields are not, it's not just a plastic carpet, it's an assembly of materials, and it is complex, and it is something that we will work really carefully to specify for a number of different criteria. So how pervious is it? How durable is it? How cool is it? How do teams and coaches like using the surface? How easy is it for Parks and Rec to maintain? And then how can we recycle it at the end of its useful life? So we're going to be looking at a lot of criteria and finding the balance between those criteria to get a field here, a system of assemblies that really performs well for Philadelphians.
Great, thank you. How you doing? I have a lot more questions, but
I'm good. Maura, jump in here anytime.
Okay.
You're doing such a great job. I don't feel like I have anything useful to add.
I'm just going to keep throwing them at you because
All
they
right.
keep coming. So this is an interesting question. So this question is sort of taking a broader view and saying, well, if you scale out, right, you look across the street, you've got all these acres and acres of parking lots. And, is there not, or was there ever any consideration of, whether instead of that just being flat, open, impervious surface, some of that space could be, by building a parking structure, some of that space could be recuperated and you could sort of have multiple layers vertically of parking and then create the space for some of the sports fields or something else on the other side of the street. I wonder if you could just talk about who owns that and whether.
Yeah. That's an important question.
I think that's a great question. I also think it does tend to blur the whole private property line. I think that for me, one of the things is yes, that would be great. It would also be great if we could take, through eminent domain, most of the homes in South Philadelphia and repurpose them as open space. I mean, I think one of the things this project tries to do is repurpose what is possible on public land, right? And that's the real, to me, the litmus test is what is actually within the capability of the city to do. I think there's an awful lot of, there's a lot of wishful thinking and blue skying. Wouldn't it be great if we could seize through eminent domain all of this public, some could be small households, some could be multifamily units, some could be post-industrial spaces or commercial spaces. And I think most people think that's a great idea until it's their property that's actually on, being claimed by eminent domain. I think that's there's a lot of magical thinking people have about climate change and resiliency within an urban setting. And I would say that sort of what if, it would be wonderful. Sure, it'd be great. But I also think that it's also unrealistic and maybe not desirable to have a political system that does make those types of eminent domain seizures, perhaps without a lot of due process. That's how I would answer that.
It's a really interesting point. And I mean, so who does own the stadium, those parking lots? Those are not owned by
Novacare.
Those are not Parks and Rec. The
No.
parking lots are not Parks and Rec land. And our task on this project was to deliver change and to deliver what is needed within the boundaries of the project and to influence the public spaces adjacent to those projects. So whether that's 95 or the intersection of Broad and Pattison, we can influence those spaces, but our project and our ability to get something done sits within this 348 acres of FDR Park.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if maybe the question is because the original park included that land, that maybe.
Where the stadium district is. Yeah, that has
There's been a lot of land ownership changes over the last 100 years. And I will say that the park expanded from 20th Street all the way to the basically the intersection with Penrose.
Oh yeah, can you mention that, but you didn't expand on when and how that happened.
Yeah, so basically the original Olmsted drawing for the park included the land that became the municipal stadium. Really quickly, that went away. So then you had basically Broad Street to 20th. In the 1940s, the city took additional land to make the other half of the park where the golf course and the 40-acre wetland site exist. So the park today has a larger footprint than it would have had if it was still intact with the Olmsted original boundaries. So the idea of going back and questioning land use decisions of 100 or 70 years ago, while it's a fun thought process, we're really focused on making sure that this place is resilient and that we've delivered the amenities and activities that Philadelphians are needed.
Thank you. So, staying with parking, this is a question about disabled parking.
Yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah, pointing out that now the parking is going to be on the edge, and so disabled folks who want to get into the core, what provisions would be made to accommodate them?
Sure. Funny you should say that, because Allison has been giving a lot of thought to ADA parking closer to the environmental core. Allison, what are some of your thoughts?
Well, I think this entire site, right, will have to be ADA compliant. So we do have parking at the urban edge in terms of lots, but let's not forget that most of the parking in FDR Park will come from on-street spaces that are dispersed along the park road. We are doubling the length of the park road when we expand it to the western half of the site. So there will be spaces dispersed in those areas, and we have created a few pocket lots along that loop road for exactly what you talk about. Parking for people who are coming with families, parking for ADA compliant parking, and all of those areas are connected to trailheads or the Franklin 5K that are accessible. One of the real challenges with FDR Park today is that the western half of the park is only accessible to people who are relatively able-bodied. The trails are not paved, they are not marked, and we have had multiple instances where folks have been overcome by illness or heat stroke in the western half of the park, and it has been challenging to get to them. In the city of Philadelphia, in one of its most dense neighborhoods, a 348-acre municipal park should be ADA accessible. It is not a backcountry experience, and it should not be for anyone.
Great. So here's a different tact for a second. What's going to happen with the Swedish Museum? How will it be impacted or incorporated into the plan? You didn't mention much about it.
It will be further made accessible. They'll be given their own park. So I'll let Al say, but I'm actually really excited because I love the Swedish Museum. It's perhaps related to my deep love of IKEA. But the Swedish Museum is actually going to have some better autonomy within this new plan. Right now, a lot of their revenues derived from events, but also when there's an event on the interior of the park space in the current layout, the Swedish Museum is often completely blocked, right? So you can think about things like a flower show that made regular operations that had other benefits for them, I believe, but it made their regular operations challenging. This plan actually removes all of the centralized event space from the immediate front of the Swedish Museum, right? It lets it be decentralized, sort of in different parts of the park, the Great Lawn. Smaller events can still happen there, but the Swedish Museum actually gets to have some autonomy over its space, its own parking, its own gate. They don't have to worry about their patrons being locked in when the Rangers close the gates at night. So I think that's if you like the Swedish Museum, I think you'll like the plan.
Yeah, through this planning process, we were really talking to all of the stakeholders from the Swedish Museum to the folks who are the caretakers at Bel Air Manor to try to understand from the people who live with the site every day, what are the shifts that can make the operations of this park easier. And a big one is finding ways to get folks in and out of the Swedish Museum after hours without having to drive through the rest of the park, because they regularly have guests locked in or gates are left open because of events, and the park isn't able to be secure. So the plan is really trying to solve circulation challenges for everybody. And that museum and Bel Air Manor, the Welcome Center, and the historic buildings on the southeast corner of the park, these are all tremendous assets and anchors in the park that we want to both restore and highlight and bring back into kind of full public use. So we see these as real opportunities to tell the history of the site.
Great. So here's someone's pointing out that you've had a lot of pushback from environmental groups. And you talked a bit about your engagement process. And I'm wondering, has there been dialogue with some of these more recent these groups that have expressed resistance to the project more recently?
Yeah.
Take it away,
yes.
Maura.
Yeah, I'll take that one. Yes, there's been ongoing dialogues with as many groups as we can get a meeting with. What's been challenging is often the main motivation for many of the environmental groups signing on is often less rooted in their own individual mission and more in a sort of general feeling. And I think that really speaks to the complexity of dealing with the actual sensitive environmental restoration piece. Generally speaking, when we've talked to folks, I speak to Audubon on the regular. I had a meeting with them yesterday. And we do, of course, always take on board every comment they'll give us. and incorporate them immediately into our plans and drawings. But, their ability to engage is going to also be limited by their own constituencies, right? So I think one of the things I want to make sure that all of these groups understand is, we absolutely understand that everybody is answerable to public opinion. Our hope is that as we inform more and more folks of what the actual facts of the project are on the ground, some of these groups will feel more free to engage proactively with the project.
So this is a question about parks, long-term parks maintenance. And so the question is, and I know that in the plan, actually you mentioned sort of what this could look like, and you talk about Brooklyn Bridge Park. And, I know that there in that case, there's sort of an interesting hybrid model of how that park is managed. And the question is, if there's an entity other than PPR that could at some point be in charge of maintenance of this park, or how maintenance, sort of long-term maintenance of the park is included in the planning process.
Yeah, this was one of the really interesting things about this planning process. So we worked with a consultant at called Greenplay, and we worked with the operations folks at Parks and Rec. We looked at existing models in Parks and Rec, and we looked at cities and other places, and we really tried to put together this thing that we've drawn, right? What will it actually cost to take care of it in the long term? What will we actually need? What will the staffing structure actually be? And so we know that this is a city-owned and operated park, but we also know throughout Philadelphia that there are both formal and informal maintenance partnerships that bring in additional resources, everything from incredible robust volunteer corps like in Friends of the Wissahickon that Maura built, where you literally have thousands of volunteers performing trail maintenance, invasive removal, planting, and litter cleanup, to places where you have private investment bringing additional resources to take care of a place, or examples like the Conservancy, where we're providing maintenance support through contracted work through our philanthropic sources. So this is a city with a lot of park and very few government resources. And so you'll see a tremendous range of partnerships that help sustain the long-term care and maintenance of the park. But again, this is City of Philadelphia parkland. It is City of Philadelphia operated and maintained first, and other groups can augment and amend that partnership.
Great. I know we're pushing almost 6 o'clock, and that is the scheduled end of this. There are still additional questions here. I wonder if we could send these to you. Nikki, I don't know, what are your thoughts about doing, if we were to do that as a, just to not, just to respect Allison and Maura's time at this point? Is there a way to get the answers back to attendees if Allison and Maura are willing to answer some of these questions afterwards?
Yeah, so the chat and the Q&A does save with the recording, so I can get those questions sent to you guys. As far as getting the answers back, I could just email the participant individually, assuming that they didn't ask the question anonymously,
Yeah.
If that works for folks.
And I would also just say, if you check out myphillypark.org, you can find the master plan, you can find the 2022 update, and you can find some of the most frequently asked questions there as well.
Yeah, and I do continue to lead walks and talks through the park live. I'm sure some of our guests have been there with me and enjoyed those walks. And we will also continue to have twice a year virtual open houses. And I'm working on right now with Rep. Regina Young, putting together another open house that she's willing to host for us. So to give us a bigger reach than just the immediate neighbors within her district. So, these are all things that I hope people will keep an eye out for. We have been, as Allison said, 50 hours of live community engagement so far in 2022. We certainly are going to do better than that by the end of the year. And that's something we're going to hold to through the entire process. I will spend time talking to absolutely anybody and everybody about this project. I have done and I will do. So, you know, there will always be lots of opportunities to engage directly with me, with consultants working on the project. And every time there's any type of development, we'll be sending that information out. We hope to have an updated release of the park plan document early in 2023, which has a sort of, you know, a new section that details the changes to the plan that came in 2022. So, and as this project unfolds over the next, you know, 15 years, I think we can look forward to other updates in the future.
Great. Well, thanks to both of you for a really informative, and thanks for fielding all those questions. I think you fielded 53 questions.
Wow.
Wow,
And
Al,
there's-
that was all you. I did like 2.
And there's only 16 open, so you've
It's-
covered most of it. And
It's
there's-
all good. And, you know, we hear the same questions on the regular because they're the things that folks are concerned about, which I totally understand.
Yeah.
Well, thanks again. And we're going to, just for our regular attendees, since this is occurring the last week of October, we did that to accommodate Allison and Maura's schedule. We're not going to do the November edition of the CC Run Seminar Series because that would be next week. And so please join us in December for our next webinar. And thanks again to Allison and Maura. This was really great. I really appreciate your time and your
Okay.
insight.
Thank you
Thanks a lot, guys. Take care.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.